Good morning, and thank you very much to IDSA for this invitation. As will become rapidly evident to all of you, I am not a specialist on cybersecurity, unlike my fellow panelists here, and unlike a lot of the other experts who are here at this conference. I've been tasked by my hosts to really sort of locate all of this issue within sort of international politics broadly. So that's what I'm going to do, since that's what I do for a living, which is teach and research international politics. Um, what do we mean by information technology? Getting down to the brass tacks for just 30 seconds. I mean, it's any technology relating to the production, manipulation, storage, communication, and dissemination of information is information technology. Whatever the media employed, whatever the hardware and software employed. All states are now, I think, getting quite serious about information technology and its many manifestations, whether on issues of security or prosperity or identity. This document here is a Technology Vision 2035 for the country. I'm one of the three authors of it. We did it for a think tank of the Government of India. It was released by the Prime Minister in January this year. And we sort of, as part of one of the 12 sectors we're dealing with is obviously information and communication technologies. I'm just flashing a couple of transparencies up so that you get some sense of this document and the project as a whole. The vision for this sector really is paperless activities and services in every form with no physical computer by 2035. So, in terms of kind of the vision statement, some sort of the roadmap that those working on this sector are sort of articulating, and obviously the application areas include pretty much everything that concerns us. A whole range of different technology areas come into play here, and there are a whole bunch of different blue sky research areas as well. To give you just one example, sensing devices to be able to feel the product on the internet before buying it, for example. But a whole range of other things. This document is readily available on the internet, and anybody who's interested, I would urge you to maybe just download it. The internet, the growth has been obviously galloping. From the time data began to be held for the first time, recorded in 1993 up to 2015. It's really been an exponential growth. We have almost 3.3 billion users of the internet. Last recorded date, which was the 1st of June 2015. So we'll get the 1st of June 2016 data in due course as well. So what does that amount to? Another graph which looks pretty much identical. If you were to look at this in terms of percentage of the world's population, approximately 41% of the world's population now uses the internet. Obviously, definitions of internet use are varied, but we are looking out here in terms of sort of any individual who habitually has access to the internet and who uses the internet for at least some sort of activity. The most common activity, obviously, for internet use is electronic mail, email, which obviously has very rapidly outclassed other forms of mail. Now, what I want to suggest is that information and communication technologies are redefining human and social possibilities, and in doing so, they are now posing some fundamental challenges to the sovereign territorial state as we have known it over the last approximately 3.5 centuries. And I believe that there are 4 ways in which cyberspace is challenging the state. The 4 distinct ways, but in a way they are interconnected. I'm going to work my way very briefly through all 4 of them. What do we mean by cyberspace? I think this is the definition I have sort of come to like, although I will explain in a moment why it is a limited definition. This is a definition by Martin Libicki, a researcher at the RAND Corporation, who defines cyberspace as the sum of the globe's communication links and computation nodes. So that really, in a way, is what cyberspace is. But I will try to show in a moment that, in a way, when we define the cyberspace in these terms, and there's nothing wrong with this definition, it sort of fundamentally misses a critical element, which is territoriality. And I think that is pretty fundamental, and we need to get our heads around that as well. So let's working our way through sort of the ways in which the internet is now impacting, and cyberspace more particularly is impacting on states. If you were to look at sort of ISIS supporters, where are they tweeting from? You can see that they are clustered around the Persian slash Arabian Gulf, parts of the Maghreb, the UK, but also the United States. If you were to if you were to look at the Europeans who are, as it were, joining extremist groups, you can see that they really span pretty much all of the countries of Europe. If you were to ask, in terms of Arab internet use in Arabic, those who support views of the ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh, you will see again that it's pretty widespread. It includes some very obvious countries, but it looks, some which on the face of it are very non-obvious countries. And this is the concrete face of some of those young Europeans who have now actively joined the ranks of ISIS or Daesh. Now, here's another photograph of a group of Asians from Indonesia this time who equally joined Daesh. So what does this all mean then in terms of challenges to the state? It means this really. Cyberspace's first redefinition is about people themselves. In a fundamental sense, what cyberspace is doing is creating novel human aggregations and social configurations and throwing up new possibilities of community. So cyberspace makes it possible really for people to interact with each other, interact with people who they would otherwise never have met, and in the process of so doing to find core similarities. So it's not just really therefore about getting a bunch of human beings together in terms of an aggregation, or then seeing that aggregation in social terms, as a social configuration. I think the critical word here is community. In the process, what gets created over time is community, and community then becomes, in some ways, extremely powerful. A second challenge of cyberspace, I would suggest, is really spatial in nature, as the term cyberspace itself suggests. And this second challenge relates to the new coordinates of location that are being created by the existence of cyberspace. It basically, it's in some ways is self-evident, but let us just spend a few seconds thinking this through. Really, in some ways, you have the complex relationship between place and space. A concrete sense of place emerges out of the specific meanings that individual human beings and social collectivities ascribe to empty, abstract space. So space by itself is fundamentally abstract and empty. It is, if you will, coordinates of some form or the other. A particular space becomes a place when we, as individuals and as groups, give some meaning to it. So, what may be an empty geographical coordinate for person A may be the homeland for person B. So that is really the link between space and place. And here, of course, as we are now seeing, cyberspace becomes really important, because cyberspace is radically transforming both space and place by offering parallel spaces and parallel spaces and alternate places. So in a very real sense, when we all probably either ourselves or know people who live increasingly in that parallel world called cyberspace, and so some of whose most significant social and other links are in that alternate place called cyberspace. And so, in a fundamental sense, therefore, we need to, I would suggest, begin to think about cyberspace in territorial terms. Now, in the early years of the internet, it was largely seen in terms of the global commons. It was still the anarchy of the internet. It was about individuals doing their own things, as it were. But this has really turned out, in a very fundamental sense, to be an illusion, because what the internet has done is create cyberspace, and over time, states are now coming to regard this as a new form of territory. Now, there are clear analogies to this, and I think our chair actually, suggested that in his introductory remarks. As technology opens up new spaces, states try to control the new forms of territory that emerge. And I think the best analogy for us comes from the early 20th century. Through human history, we know that the skies above were considered, in effect, in terms of being the zone of freedom, if it were. The term "free as a bird" exists in about 100 different languages in some form or the other. It was seen in many, many religious and cultural traditions as an abode of humanity. That was kind of the sense of the skies, when really human beings could not really access those air columns above the earth because of the simple physical fact of gravity. And so that was the sense when it first came on, those magnificent men in their flying machines. But we know really that very soon this is what it was about. It was about warfare. So as soon as heavier than air machines took flight, states asserted their sovereignty over the air columns above their terrestrial and maritime territories, and the concept of airspace was born. So, and suddenly you had an entire new dimension of territory, as it were, which hadn't existed earlier, right? And why did this happen? This happened precisely because of the logic pertaining to state security. That was why it happened. The analogy then was with the territorial sea in international maritime law. So you had the territorial sea because you essentially had to keep potentially hostile warships at least a cannonball distance away from your shores. And that was the notion of the territorial sea. And this was exactly the same notion that was applied to airspace as well, the columns above. So it's in a way a new sense of territory, and it's completely linked. I would urge you to consider this, to evolving notions of state security. Not non-traditional security, not comprehensive security, state security. And therefore, I would say that in a fundamental sense, and this is really a core challenge in terms of cyber redefinition, is sort of this whole notion of territory itself. I think the third cyber challenge is about the purposes and manifestations of power. Now, what cyberspace does here is sort of, in a way, a bit paradoxical, because cyberspace simultaneously augments the capabilities of government, but also magnifies the demands and expectations placed by civil society upon it. And we are seeing this in country after country. The expectations are increasing, and it's that tide of rising expectations that states and governments are finding very, very difficult to actually meet. So in some ways, therefore, you could say that these technologies and cyberspace itself is a tool for governments. It's a tool by which they can do things in physical space. But the point is, the demands upon them are increasing as well. And if you add on to this other fact, you can see that the challenge becomes even more severe, because cyberspace provides insurgents with new ways to challenge established power structures. So it's not therefore merely a question about states providing a set of goods and services to their populations, but it's about how states deal with those who will, for whatever reason they think appropriate, challenge established power structures, which of course is really another way of saying the state. So ICT can be used as a tool by government, but cyberspace itself needs to be governed. So, I think we need to sort of understand that. As soon as it becomes a space, it's crying for government. That notion in the early years of the internet, of the anarchy of the internet, is just simply cannot stand. You cannot have the sovereign territorial state and the internet simultaneously. It's as simple as that from an international relations perspective as I see it. And I think, of course, finally, and I'm not going to say very much more about it, cyberspace fundamentally challenges notions of exclusive jurisdiction that are inherent in traditional understandings of statehood. So the whole notion of this of the sovereign territorial state, the whole notion of exclusive jurisdiction itself, in a fundamental sense, gets challenged. And I don't think it is actually coincidental that the challenges emanating from cyber redefinition impact upon the four classical elements of statehood: population, territory, government, and sovereignty. So all four of them, as we have sort of in political science textbooks for a century defined sovereignty and the state, the four pillars of the state and of sovereignty, all four of them are fundamentally being redefined, and to some extent I would suggest challenged by the creation of this new space. And all four of them, I would suggest, have significant impact upon state security. Now, obviously, we know this. We're talking about it in terms of challenges, but challenges not adequately addressed and dealt with become existential threats. So, when a challenge becomes a security issue, it's very often just a matter of time or just a matter of context. What may start off as a challenge, if left unaddressed, can become an existential threat. And as states, societies, and economies become ever more dependent upon information technology, cyberspace will inevitably become a theater of war. That sort of is one of the things that I would like to suggest to you. And I do sort of out here emphasize the word inevitable. That this is necessarily going to happen. And just as we have in the physical world got accustomed to a world where conflict exists with cooperation, where we have issues of life and death coexisting with issues of bread and butter, you're going to find much the same thing existing on this parallel space as well. You're going to have cooperation for sure. You're going to have lots of commerce for sure. You're going to have community building for sure. But you're not just going to have prosperity and identity. You're going to have security concerns as well. Now, UNIDIR, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, in a 2013 study, suggested that more than 40 states have developed some military cyber capabilities. And at least 12 states have developed some capabilities to conduct offensive cyber warfare. ICT quite evidently is dual use. It consists of frontier technologies that have legitimate commercial and industrial applications, but the various range of technologies going under ICT are also potentially lethal. And in some important ways, I have come to believe that it makes sense to treat the lethal side of ICT as a new form of weapons of mass destruction, as we really think about it in some ways as we would address WMD themselves. Why? Well, these new ICT-driven lethal technologies are destructive over long distances. They have the potential to destroy at the mass scale and can destroy in extremely short time frames. Furthermore, they have the potential to replace the human element with machines, and they have empowered small insurgent groups across the world. So I think that there is, in fact, a compelling sense for us to begin to at least think about all of these challenges in the way we have, using some of the analogies to the extent that they fit with sort of WMD as we know them. There was a very important group that was set up by the UN Secretary General, 15 experts from the P5 of the UN Security Council. Australia was in the chair and also included Argentina, Belarus, Canada, Egypt, Estonia, Germany, India, Indonesia, and Japan. This was really an attempt to get the P5 plus a bunch of some of the significant, internet players from the various continents. And this group sort of came up with its report with kind of a somewhat cumbersome title of Developments in the Field of Information and Telecommunications in the Context of International Security. It's actually in some ways a rather important document. This was based on a General Assembly mandate of 2012. And the other sort of parallel development on a bilateral track was during the G8 summit in 2013 in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland, where you had President Obama and President Putin actually agreeing on a raft of bilateral confidence building measures when it comes to the whole area of cybersecurity. So we can begin to see, therefore, that there is movement both sort of on the multilateral track as well as on the bilateral track. And it's really about states now at the highest levels beginning to see this in security terms. So I would say cyberspace is already securitized. And this notion that will it become securitized, I think is in some ways fantasy land. I think outer space is in fact much less securitized even today, even though those technologies have existed for much longer than cyberspace has. And that one reason may just be that cyberspace impacts on human beings in a much more real, direct, and quotidian way than outer space does. Now, some of the findings, and I'm almost wrapping up, Mr. Chairman. I'll literally be done in about, I hope, not more than a minute. That one of the things, the 3 or 4 kind of findings that I just like to highlight before I step off: absence of a common understanding on applicable international rules for state behavior in cyberspace. So as of today, in fact, there is an absence of what those international interstate rules would be. There is clearly a danger of false flag attacks. Attributability to perpetrator is a fundamental problem in this whole domain. because of global connectivity, vulnerable technologies, and anonymity. International law, including the principles of the law of state responsibility, fully apply to state behavior in cyberspace. So just as states have to take responsibility for actions on or emanating from their physical territories, it's going to in the future be much the same with regards to those virtual territories as well. Um, and of course, the right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter would apply, this group of 15 experts said, should a cyber attack be deemed to be an armed attack. Okay, I'm literally on my last slide. Although ICT is self-evidently artificial, in fact, the more pedantic amongst us in the university system, we sort of blanch a little and cavil when sort of computer science is treated as a natural science, because whatever else it is, it's not a natural science, right? We academics can be exceedingly navel gazing at times, but here's the point: ICT is self-evidently artificial. It doesn't exist in nature. But really, in some ways, the best WMD analogy is paradoxically with biotechnology. Namely, the technology that uses biological systems, living organisms, or derivatives thereof to make or modify products or processes for specific use. And just as we have not till today had a biological and toxin weapons convention, although we have a fully robust functioning chemical weapons convention with its own international organization, with all of its entire verification protocols and the rest of it, says something. And the reason we do not have a biological and toxin weapons convention is because ultimately these are living organisms. They can mutate, and so you can never know whether, for instance, the Zika virus came out ultimately out of a research laboratory or evolved naturally in nature, and so on and so forth. There will always be a question mark about them. And I think this is, in a way, the thing that this whole new domain shares with sort of the biodomain, the shared problem of non-attributability to specific perpetrators. I'll stop now. Thank you.